have 20 minutes for this first part. I don't want to tell you about me at all. I've taught in public schools for 20 years, started in third grade, worked in every grade through high school, then became an administrator and all of that, went to the university, and now I'm doing independent research and consulting. Is that enough so we can just start and go? Okay, sorry, but with the short amount of time, what I want to talk to you about is, we're talking here and you're using the design learning process and aspects of it, and you're doing it willfully to cause students to learn well. That's the intent, and to have skills that transfer and so forth afterward, and all that goes in it. Well, there's a body of literature that John Hattie has just finished. Maybe you've seen his work, Visible Learning. And if you go through that, he looked at just about every bit of research there was on education and learning, 800 plus meta-analyses, 50,000 studies, 200 million students, and at the end of the day, 138 different strategies that are common across schools and learning and settings. And it seems to me we ought to be aware of not just what keeps coming our way. Oh, this is good stuff, everyone will sell you this. This is research-based. Is anybody using anything that is not research-based anymore? Nobody's selling a product that is not research-based. And they all have a study that says, and it's the best thing you'll ever do. And we've been there how many times to date and not seen the outcomes or the effects. And most of the time, those studies are presented to us in education as percent differences. And they don't go all the way back to the primary studies and look at the original research and the effect size and the design of the study and so forth. So just a very quick, if we get out of the other statistics and go to effect size, we're looking at standard deviations, the bell curve. How much of a deviation from normal or typical or average or expected is this? One standard deviation is huge. It's just wow if anything gets close to a 1. So 1 is a big number. We're usually looking at 0.2 or 0.24 or things like that. So I want to differentiate along this line. What are the highest impact strategies known to produce learning outcomes? And are they embedded not only in design but other things we do? So is something research-based if it has a negative effect size? Sure. They researched it, it just had a negative effect. There are things in our schools that have negative effects, aren't there? And we know what some of those are. Is it research-based if it's plus 0.21 rather? Yes. So research-based doesn't tell us enough. It tells us somebody did a study or 2 or 3, but it doesn't really tell us whether it matters to what we're doing or whether it's the best thing for us to do. So Hattie did a really nice way of organizing this information visually, puts it in the bell curve, and lo and behold, here's 0 way over here. In other words, most people find what they look for. If they study something, it's because they want to have a finding and they get a finding. The issue is, okay, they got a finding, so it's research-based, so of course we have to have it. Not so fast. There are some actual negative effects. Good to know what actually goes the opposite way. Then there's a whole body of things that are 0.40 or less. In other words, they all have a positive effect, but it's less than typical. It's not the more powerful effect sizes, it's the lesser effect sizes. So shouldn't we know what's in all of those, and don't we want to use high impact? So what I thought I'd do first is take that sheet I handed out and start to fill out, what do you think the highest effect sizes are in that sheet? These are not the top 10 or 20 or 12. They're just a random group of a dozen different strategies commonly used in education. You'll recognize most of the vocabulary and terms. Very quickly, decide which you think the highest 3 impact items are. Identify the 3 you think will have the highest impact for student learning, and a couple that maybe have the lowest. So just from your experience, what we've been sold by programs and publishers and other things, quickly put something down as to what your thoughts are. And I'm not going to ask you to complete it, because completing it isn't the purpose of this, but just looking. Have you all identified what you think some really high impact strategies are? They are in order on your sheet from highest to lowest. So are there some surprises here? So as you look at this and what we have learned or been told or worked with through our careers, isn't it interesting? Individualized instruction has a fairly low effect size, and yet what have we moved toward over the last 3 decades in education? Does that mean it never works to individually work with a student? No. It means when we look at the range of how it's done and the studies that are done, the aggregate suggests it is not one of the higher impact ways to cause learning. So it doesn't mean there aren't any.
Because the instruction may not change, they may just be saying it louder and slower.
Yeah, because a lot of the ways people go about individual instruction may not be the most effective strategies, whether it's individual, small group, or whole group. So it really matters what is the strategy, even with an individual. So rather than getting into a lot of this, we of course know teacher-student relationships, and that's a principal part in your process. What is the relationship to your problem, to each other as you work through the process? I'm going to go through and say, okay, let's look at some of the surprises back on the bell curve. We know holding kids back every now and then works, but for the most part, it doesn't. It's not a practice that has a good outcome for the most part. So retaining students has a negative transfer. Class size, everybody wants fewer kids so we can do more individualized instruction. Lo and behold, way below midline for effect size. Number of students in the room is not the determining factor for most things. Would it be nice? Of course. We're not saying it does have a positive effect size. It's just not as big an effect as several other things. Let's look at teacher subject matter knowledge. Barely a positive effect size. How can that be? Does subject matter knowledge and expertise matter? I think we would all say absolutely. But if you have a teacher with great expertise and no capacity to convey it, it's not being utilized or playing out well. Make sense? So now when you see it in the literature, it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It means unless that teacher also has the skills to implement well effective high-impact strategies, the subject matter knowledge is staying within and not being assisted outside. Make sense now? Because in the end, I'm going to suggest to you that it isn't just where this falls on the scale, it's are we incorporating some of the lower prevalent items with some of the higher ones so we're getting the best of both worlds. Because if we reside in just the low-end world, so to speak, the low effect size world, we're not reaping what the high effect size world can do with and for students. So let's move past this. By the way, you know where I'm going, don't you? You know I'm going up to feedback, formative assessment, and the items that are in the top 10. Because those have to get considered somewhere along the way as we work with students. So looking at some of the lowest ones, what Hattie calls disasters. Not just not okay, but disasters. And you look what's in here, and look, if our whole focus is on HQT, highly qualified teaching, and not on strategies and effective approaches along with it, it falls short. As a practice alone, it doesn't get the job done. And we could go on through a lot of these. We used to worry about a lot of television time. It's still up there. Kids still watch television. We worry about computers and games. TV is still a huge factor in young people's lives. They actually watch TV on the computers, right? So here we go. Class size, still in the low. Individualized instruction in the low. Still, he's saying not worth it yet. We have limited resources, limited time. How do we invest? Where do we put them? So now let's nearing average. We still aren't even up to average, and we're looking at how much time have schools spent over the last decade teaching, test taking, and teaching to the tests and all of that. And we shudder a little bit, don't we? But now we actually have some literature saying, does it help some kids? Yes, we have some positive effect, but it's not even at average. So, is it really worth the resource of time and energy to go in that direction? Now we're getting right at the cusp of what's average or typical time on task. Does it matter? Of course it does. You have to be on task. But now that you're on task, how are you doing it? So now we have to look at, we want time on task. We want their attention to task. But as you would say in the design world, what kind of process are they using while they are attending to task? So we're going to start to put two things together to say, okay, cooperative learning. Do we work in groups? pairs, triads, fours, other size groups. Do we all believe that makes sense to do? I think generally most of us do that, have done that, and believe in that. So do I. I would use groups and pairs frequently. But while they're in the group, what's happening becomes the question. So we're going to look to the top 20 impact things to say, while you're in this group, which we already know is a good format, what's going on in the group? Because that now will drive impact. So we can see how these things get together. Now we're in the top 20. So we're getting closer to, notice 17.65, nice, huge creativity programs. So we have to dig in. What do those look like? What can we do? What are the elements? So forth. But now we're seeing some things that you're also seeing in the design process and in other aspects of what you're interested in. Here's the top 10. Self-reported grades. When students track their own learning, critically thinking about the process they are in, they're learning what they need to know, what questions they have, the number one most effective thing they can do to cause their own achievement. Where students have to think about, what do I need to do to be successful in this? What are the criteria for maximizing learning? And how do I get involved in tracking it, not just get feedback from the teacher called a grade or a score or something else? So as we go down, and I'm not going to do too many here because of time, providing formative evaluation, we're going to spend some time this afternoon and a little more later when I speak again on that topic. And of course, feedback down here, 0.73. These are the top 10 in all of those 50,000 studies. Effect size in the aggregate, looking across the different components of the research. The most powerful feedback ever is not what we give to the kids, it's the feedback they give to us. The hardest thing in the world in real time is to decipher that feedback because it's coming every minute, every second of every day. And so how do we sort that out to know what of it really tells us about learning targets that are being missed or hit? What happens if a school actually says, I want to use 4 or 5 of the top 10? I mean, that's a logical thing to think, isn't it? So if I say, if these in fact have that much impact, what happens if we really, really use them? So we went to school 6 years ago and we were using 4, sometimes a 5th out of the top 10 every time we went, every 3 weeks for several years. Well, here's the results on, the standardized tests we all take. Whether yours is the MCAS or the NECAP or the this or the that, you take it every year and it gets in the newspaper and all that stuff. Blue is 3rd grade, red is 4th grade. Here's where the kids started. 61, 69% proficient on those standardized assessments. They started using 4 to 5 of the top 10 strategies in 1 year. That is not 1 or 2 digit gains. These are huge leaps in a single year. By the second year, they're 81 and 91, 84, 88. Now, oops, what happened? Over that summer, 18% influx of homeless and coded students. So they come in, tests start in 3rd grade, not 2nd. They come into the school, boom, 68, big drop. Everybody's shocked, but we can identify why we think it is. But look at those 3rd graders, 68%, as 4th graders, the next year. 24% increase on a standardized measure of kids proficient. You almost never see that. If we in fact use the high effect strategies, we ought to expect to see learners do more with what we are providing for them. It's not about whether we're providing most of the time. It's what are the learners doing with what we're providing. At the end of the day, it's what did they do in their heads with it, not what did we do out here in the environment. The environment matters, and we set it up so as to cause what type of processing. Is it to short-term memory, feedback, regurgitation, or is it really to knowledge, understanding, and transfer? That has to be our goal, I think. So nice, we left, and they did even better. So finally, it's good to see people go, right? Because things don't always need an outside person. Here's an urban school. We went in June of the school year. Last 3 weeks of the year, great time to start a new initiative. So you gotta be laughing out loud. Who would even do that? Fractions in third grade, they had already started teaching the unit. We got them to use 4 of these strategies in the last 3 weeks. And overall, the kids went from 50 to 90% proficient in the entire grade in 3 weeks. It matters what they do with what we are offering them. And formative feedback was the principal key piece. You all know Marzano's study, Pickering and Pollock, 2001, the 9 most effective ways. They studied a lot of the research at that time. They took it into the field and actually used it like you and I have to when we work with kids. And they said, all right, here's what the literature said. Let's go in the field and try this stuff out. Here's what they found. The 2 most effective things, the highest impacting elements from their literature, formative tracking, formative, number 3, tracking, number 1, on Hatties. So there's a nice crossover. Student progress scoring scales, setting objectives, providing feedback. The 2 highest impact things they found in the top 10 of Hattie. Nice when literature actually coincides and doesn't conflict. So as educators, of course, we must deal with the top 20. We can't do it every day, every lesson, every this and that. It's not about that. It's about understanding where they best fit. And when we're doing cooperative learning, group activities, what piece of the top 20 might fit where in this process we're going through? It might be somewhere in the whole unit, not in every lesson every day. But the awareness of the impact of these will eventually help them move.